you hear this refrain, while people love their cars, they are prefer their cars. There's no way they're going to get on foot or on bike or on public transport system. Well, I mean, I think the simple answer to that is they haven't been given a choice. You don't get much city left when you start building around the car, and it really degrades the quality of life in the city, the accessibility of the city, the inclusiveness of the city. And the national government sees car ownership as motorway construction, airport construction, expansion, and usage as keys to a growing economy. But all of those externalities that come with car usage in particular are downloaded to the local government. It's the municipal officials that have to deal with the crushing congestion, the air pollution, the lack of safety, the injuries, the fatalities. The local government has to deal with a lack of livability in the city. Change in cities is really hard because we have this intensive minority that will mobilize as soon as you propose any change and get it dead in its tracks in a lot of cases. And it does require some significant political commitment, political will, political vision to break through the status quo and make change happen. Almost a third of the median income just for mode of transportation, which means you're working from January to April just to pay for your car to get to the office. And the rest of the year you're paying for housing, and you have very little left for anything else.
Are we on? Right, let's go. Welcome to another episode of the OoruLabs podcast from Bengaluru. Ever complain how bad our cities are, how bad your commute is? You'll get to hear from people who are working to solve these problems in their own way. This is your weekly soapbox for urban sustainability. I'm your host, Sathya Sankaran. Joining us from the Netherlands is Chris Bruntlett. Melissa and Chris Bruntlett are authors and urban mobility advocates who strive to communicate the benefits of sustainable transport and inspire a happier, healthier, and more human scale cities. They are authors of two books: Building the Cycling Cities, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, which I have right behind me, and Curbing Traffic, the Human Case for Fewer Cars on Our Roads. So, today we'll be talking to Chris about his books and his journey around trying to achieve these goals and what he has observed over the course of traveling many countries and cities. So, let's dig right in, Chris. First of all, welcome to the show.
No, thanks for having me, Satya. It's great to see you again after enjoying beers over a cricket match in Delhi just a few weeks ago.
I did, and I did caption it as while we are importing cycling, we're trying to export cricket to the Netherlands. They did quite okay, I guess, in the World Cup. Uh, but yeah, let's just jump into why humans have this fascination for cars. I mean, why are we so afraid of giving it up? What do you think it is?
Yeah, boy. I mean, we could just talk about this one topic for hours, and people have
That's
written entire
that's the plan. That's really the plan.
people have written entire books on this. Peter Norton, his seminal work, Fighting Traffic, kind of told the story of the rise of the automobile in the Western world, pre and post Second World War, and yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of things, and I want to be careful not to, um, well, accept the premise that cars are what everybody prefers, and people just prefer the car over every mode of transportation, as if that's what the market chose. Because I think there are, if you read Fighting Traffic and other stories around that time, is the car emerged as the future of mobility after the Second World War, but it wasn't without severe interventions at the urban planning, the policy making level that led to it becoming the status quo, to it becoming basically the only choice for a lot of people living in cities. From the amount of money that was put into motorways, the origin of jaywalking laws that got those pesky pedestrians off the street, a whole public relations campaign that rebranded the street as a place for cars, and everybody else had to get out of the way of cars to allow the traffic to flow freely. The dismantlement of public transport systems, including famously, the Los Angeles trolley network, which at the time was the biggest in the world, by all of the vested interests that had money to make in car-based transportation system, from the tire manufacturers to the car makers, of course, to the urban planners, the gasoline producers, and all these decades later, we have this vicious circle of car dependency that's gone on for decades and decades in the Western world, that cities are now trying to unravel and unwind and reverse. Um, but often when you do that, you hear this refrain: "While people love their cars, they prefer their cars. There's no way they're going to get on foot or on bike or on public transport system." Well, I mean, I think the simple answer to that is they haven't been given a choice for a very long period of time. So we can't say they prefer the car when they haven't really been given a serious alternative. So yeah, the car serves a purpose in our transportation system, even here in the Netherlands. Dutch people own cars at the same rate as much of the Western world. They still use them, but they're one of probably four different tools that each resident of the Netherlands has at their disposal, depending on what journey they're taking that day. And I think this is the nuance that's often left in this conversation, that it's either cars or bikes, cars or public transport. Well, we're not arguing for one or the other, or the car-free utopia. It's that we should be providing people with choices, and if they want to drive, if they need to drive, of course, let them take the car. But unfortunately, right now, in a lot of places around the Western world, people don't have a choice. And then we get into emerging economies such as India, and this aspiring, growing middle class, this idea that everybody wants a big, shiny SUV or sports car. Again, it's certainly true to a certain segment of the population, but they've been absolutely inundated with billions, if not trillions, in advertising and marketing and cars. Aspirational, it's a status symbol. They sell these cars using emotion, using images of empty streets, of clean air, of driving through forests and empty cities, and they don't reflect the reality of driving in the city. And I think, this is the argument that we're trying to make, is that we cannot, there's a tragedy of the commons here. When an unlimited amount of people try to access a limited amount of space, we can't add enough lanes to the motorways and streets. We can't add enough parking spaces in the city. You don't get much city left when you start building around the car. And it really degrades the quality of life in the city, the accessibility of the city, the inclusiveness of the city in terms of allowing everybody to use the streets. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in, not just in the Western world, but in other emerging economies that are following in the footsteps of the West and aspiring to one car for every household, if not more, which obviously comes with all kinds of problems when it comes to not just the environment, but the quality of life in the city.
The economy around cars and the cities that are built by the planners are being built for the cars. There has to be a reason for that. It is ostensibly to increase the GDP of the country, because we've been told that all that metal that is being consumed, all the stuff that is being built, and all the jobs that it is being creating is worth it in the long run. But then the consequences of all of that has also been felt. What do you think it takes for people now to realize, and are people in the government realizing that they have favored something that is not sustainable in the long run? Or are they still defending it in some way, saying now it is a practice and we can't turn it back, or even if we do, it's only going to be symbolic? It's not happening as fast as you think it should, right?
Well, I think you've described something that is true of almost every country in the world, is this friction and contrasting interests between what's happening at the local level and what's happening at the national level. And it's even true here in the Netherlands, that the national government sees car ownership as motorway construction, airport construction, expansion and usage as keys to a growing economy. And they're going to do everything they can to stimulate that, incentives, subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, but also to the construction industry, and also, of course, the car manufacturing industry. The latest manifestation of which is the e-car subsidies, which are in the thousands versus, what you can get for an e-bike, despite it being far more efficient. But all of those externalities that come with increased car usage in particular are downloaded to the local government. It's the municipal officials that have to deal with the crushing congestion, the air pollution, the lack of safety, the injuries, the fatalities. The local government has to deal with a lack of livability in the city. And they're the ones that are moving with urgency, with resources, with political will to try and reverse that. And it can only be done really, with the fairly limited resources that local governments have, in small pockets, in terms of creating new cycling infrastructure, new traffic circulation plans, low traffic neighborhoods. And while the national government is still views this equation through the GDP lens, if you will, then all the gains that are made at the local government level are going to be minuscule in comparison, and they're going to be outweighed by what's being done at the national level. So it's a challenge, and unfortunately, until national governments recognize that this is a problem, they perhaps start facing similar externalities and costs themselves. We're not going to see a significant change. So when you talk about cities like Paris, like Barcelona, like Bogota, like other global cities that are making these changes to their streets, they require an immense amount of political will, because of all of those vested interests and again, 50, 60, 70 years of building and prioritizing for cars. You're going to get pushback irregardless, and that's exactly what's happened. The protests, the death threats, the negative media coverage, the lawsuits. These local politicians really have to stick their neck out and put their physical and mental health on the line to actually get change done in their cities, and that should not be the case, needless to say. And that's why it's so inconsistent, because most normal people, most regular people do not want to put themselves through that type of controversy or discomfort in terms of the backlash that comes. But another thing that I think is incredibly important that we have to point out is the backlash is not proportional to the general sentiment of the community or the city. People living in cities know this problem. They can see this problem. They experience this problem every day, and they want their politicians to do something about the rise of the car in their streets. But we have this intensive minority that are very, middle class, very powerful, very well connected, who will lobby for against change as soon as it's proposed, whether it's bike infrastructure, whether it's new housing, whether it's changes to parking minimums. Change in cities is really hard because we have this intensive minority that will mobilize as soon as you propose any change and get it dead in its tracks in a lot of cases. And it does require some significant political commitment, political will, political vision to break through the status quo and make change happen. So there's a lot happening here, and it's an attempt to explain why it's moving so slowly and why it's so inconsistent. But I hope, beyond hope, that as more cities come to this realization, is we see that the car-first city and the livable city are mutually exclusive places. And at the national level, if we see that GDP is not the one and only thing we should be measuring, that we will see change happen much quicker and much more consistently in cities, regions, countries around the world, as they wake up to this understanding that the car is not an equitable solution. Self-driving, autonomous, electric vehicles, flying vehicles, they're not going to be accessible to everybody. They're not going to fix the vast majority of problems that come with widespread car ownership in the city. And we do need to stop focusing on the future, on the techno-utopian future that we're being presented, and start looking at some really low-cost, simplistic, but effective solutions like walking, like cycling, and both of which in combination with public transport that's where you really break the code and increase the livability, accessibility, and quality of public space in your city.
Hope is a four-letter word, but that's all we have going for right now. Before I come back to the backlash, I want to address what is the loss to the cities. You did mention that the cities are struggling to claw back the space, right, to
Yeah,
prevent the cars from taking over. And you also said they're not mutually exclusive. To answer this question, I want to go back to because your books dwell a lot on these topics as to what is this thing that so let's understand, why did you write these books? What were you trying to get across in writing these books? And these two books are I'll put the links in the show notes to the books, but they are, one was about building the cycling city, the case for having a cycling city, and the other one is focused clearly on curbing the car.
yeah,
Why
yeah.
these two books, and what's different between them? Have you changed the approach in writing to them?
Yeah, no, I think it's both books. Each of the two books represent different stages in our own journey as advocates, Melissa and I. The first book was written at a time where we were heavily cycling focused. We were living, working in Vancouver, which in and of itself was going through a lot of changes and building a lot of new cycle lanes, getting a lot of new people cycling. And it was kind of this 5-week trip we took to the Netherlands that we had this light bulb moment that we saw the Netherlands has the blueprint. It has all of the best practices that we can take to not just Vancouver, but other cities around the world. Not a copy paste, of course, but translating the ideas of network design, intersection design, bike parking in combination with public transport, all the things the Dutch do remarkably well. Well, other global cities are already starting to implement it, albeit a bit, on a smaller scale, of course. But at that moment in our lives, yeah, in 2018, the bicycle was the tool to transform our cities. And then, we got these dream jobs in the Netherlands. We moved our family to Delft in 2019 after the book had been out for about a year. And the process of visiting the Netherlands as a tourist is one thing, but living here as a resident was another experience. And we came to an understanding that it's not about the bike. It's, the Dutch cities use the bike to achieve its end goals, which is a low car, livable, more equitable city. And all of these benefits that we'd read about over the years in terms of having fewer cars in our lives, from the increased social connections on our street to improved childhood autonomy, the ability to age in place, improved mental health. Uh, um, we're suddenly experiencing that in our own daily lives, and so we decided, to try and capture that in a story, drawing in the policy decisions that Delft had made, but bringing back that larger argument, that bigger picture focus, that it's not about the bike, it's about building a livable city, and cities in the Netherlands have used the bike as a tool. Other places in the world use other tools. Swiss cities are incredibly livable because they have a fast, frequent tram network. Other cities are more walkable and use walking as a means. But at the end of the day, it's about replacing as many car trips as possible, stopping cars from filtering through your city. And that's the point that we're at right now in our advocacy is, we're enjoying this quality of life, this improved physical, mental, social, and financial health. And cities around the world, residents around the world deserve to live, enjoy the similar quality of life. But it's the car is standing in our way, if you will. The dominance of the car, the dependence on cars is really a hindrance to that end goal. And so our day jobs, we're lucky enough now to work for organizations to help cities understand the why, which was curbing traffic, why we need to get to this point, but also the how, insofar as the best practices that were outlined in building the cycling city to start implementing these strategies, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take decades, as the Netherlands learned and had to go through themselves. But at least because we know we've learned the lessons from the Netherlands, we can avoid the mistakes they made. We can act almost in a accelerated way and go straight to the stuff that works, as we often say. And so we're now lucky enough, to be in a position where we can hopefully offer some guidance, some teachings, and some support to cities that have decided they also want to go down this path.
Strongly recommend reading that book, Curbing Traffic, to understand this whole thing. But you use three key words, right? Mental, social, and financial well-being and health that you have found by living in Netherlands. Of course, the common factor you draw between, I'm assuming some of your Canadian cities are also quite livable, but the Swiss cities are livable without that much cycling. But at the end of the day, the focus is on curbing the car. And that's why I started the question with the car. We have done so much damage that people are trying to really pull the handbrakes on this one and not able to do it. But it's hard for the people in aspirational economies like ours to actually think that building a city without cars or catering to the cars can actually give you mental, social, and financial health well-being. How does that even look? Anecdotally, not even with numbers, but anecdotally, how does that even feel? By you've been in India as well. When I met you here, uh,
Mm-hmm.
you can draw those comparisons and literally tell people this is how you would feel if you were here. Maybe help us transport that a little bit, because we can't be there. Not most of our
Yeah.
listeners can be there. How would you explain that?
Well, I would start by describing the reality in Delhi and virtually any other city in the world, which is, 60 to 70% of the public realm has been completely given over to fast moving motor vehicle traffic. And it means that if you're in any other mode of transportation, in foot, bike, rickshaw, cargo bike, whatever, you are an impediment to that free flowing traffic. And you are not welcome to use the streets, essentially. And it's only by, really kind of tipping the scales, creating space and opportunities for new mode of transportation that you eventually, again, not overnight, but create streets which are no longer uh, purely places to pass through, but are in a lot of ways places for people to spend time and money. And of course, you see this in pockets in Delhi, people using the street through the informal economy, through meeting friends and neighbors for a cup of chai in the morning. This is what our streets used to look like before the rise of the automobile, and we've given that all away to the point where there's very few opportunities to meet your neighbors, to have high moments in the city, to have restorative moments where you are able to disconnect, decompress from the stresses of the day. You can take a walk through a park, a forest, along a river without noise, without the stresses of motor traffic. Uh, these are things that psychologists say are keys to good mental health. And again, we've completely given it away by building asphalt upon asphalt upon asphalt, and leaving very little space for restorative opportunities within the city. And then the financial situation is quite simple, and it's something we don't discuss nearly enough, is how much of our income we dedicate to our mode of transportation in a car-based society. In Canada, it's almost a third of the median income just for mode of transportation, which means you're working from January to April just to pay for your car to get to the office, and the rest of the year you're paying for housing, and you have very little left for anything else. And then in emerging economies, it's completely disproportionate to the average amount of income. It's completely out of reach to the average citizen, and yet we dedicate all of our time, all of our resources, all of our space to this mode of transportation, which right now in Delhi is only accessible to 3% of the residents. It's a completely inequitable situation. But even with a growing middle class, even with higher incomes for everybody, we're still putting way too much money into our mode of transportation. This is money, almost a tax, an additional tax that the decision makers, that the urban planners, that the transportation planners are putting on the residents, that goes towards gasoline, goes towards maintenance, goes towards parking, goes towards financing the vehicle itself, and leaves you with very little money left over for your daily life. So when we talk about quality of life, yeah, it's complicated and it's messy, and it's not just about mobility, but it's about, in a lot of ways, the quality of public spaces in your city, the ability to meet friends and neighbors, to have these restorative moments, to have money in your pocket for leisure activities and entertainment, and to be healthy in general, and that is moving your body and not being sedentary for your job, but also your mode of transportation. Basically, we don't talk often enough about the obesity crisis in the terms of the impact that transportation has on that. We're solely focused on the food we're putting in our mouths and the quality of our diets. Well, if we're not getting any physical activity throughout the day, that's also going to worsen the problem. So our aspirations are, in a lot of ways, perhaps a little bit misguided. Again, it's not to say that we should be stopping everybody from owning a car, but we should also be keeping these externalities, the visible and the invisible externalities, on the people living in the city, when we design solely to prioritize one single mode of transportation instead of creating a more balanced approach, which is what we're really arguing for.
Let's talk about the backlash and the externalities. There is the hardware and there is the software, which is there's the infrastructure and there is the mindset of people which has evolved over time that you mentioned. uh, 100 years of car dependence has conditioned people into thinking that's one of the primary ways in which we can move. And there's an underappreciation or an undervaluation of uh, the choices that can be made. It's almost as though it is very hard to get the cycle infrastructure, so might as well try to stick with this whole car thing and make it better for us by increasing the supply and even reducing further the space available for the choices like walking and cycling, which we see a lot in our country. Uh, how do you think we should tackle the mindset bit? While I know that there is a good majority of people who would take the option, given the option, because I see that practically in a lot of people, how do you think we tackle the whole software piece, the mindset piece of uh, the people, the decision makers, and the economy itself?
Yeah, I think you've identified something critically important here, and it's another thing that we often stress when we start talking to a city is, we cannot assume that this is an unpopular uh, movement, or the change that we're arguing for is actually controversial. That there's, in most places, this really pent up latent demand that exists for walkable, bikeable streets. And we particularly saw this during the pandemic. Once the car traffic subsided, as cities
Mm.
went into lockdown, people went out and used their streets in new and interesting ways, and met their neighbors oftentimes for the first time. And they were getting exercise. They weren't worried about the danger of traffic. They weren't worried about the air and noise pollution. Uh, and you even saw this during the Rahiri Day event in Delhi, which they do now, most Sunday mornings, is people flock to those spaces. The car-free day, that's just for a couple of hours on a Sunday morning, but you see a diversity of people walking and cycling and rolling, uh, that you don't see outside of those car-free spaces, because these are opportunities that we're providing for that invisible majority. And this is, the point that I hope most elected officials the most important point that they can take away from this conversation is, again and again, we see that there's this quite a significant consensus, but a quiet consensus within our cities and neighborhoods, that people want safer streets. They want the opportunities for their children to get to school without having to drive them in an SUV. They want the ability to go for a cycle ride to the corner store without putting their life in danger. But they're not necessarily out there lobbying for these types of changes. They're not on social media. They're not organized in advocacy groups. They're not writing letters to the newspaper or to their elected official. They are not engaged. They don't have the time or the interest or the passion to lobby for this. And so we're left with, kind of the fringe elements on either side that are arguing for and against a change in the status quo that elected officials see, and they just think, this is controversial. This is, they assume that it's unpopular because they often hear the angriest, loudest, most impassioned voices against change, and they don't act, and it's reflected in their policy making. It's reflected in their decision making because they're listening to the vested interests rather than the voices of their residents. And it's our job, I think, as advocates, as professionals, as agents of change, to try and articulate, capture those voices, to try and put a voice to the invisible majority that exists, to give that latent demand some manifestation in front of the elected officials, to help them see and understand that if we probably did a scientific poll in most neighborhoods and cities, these are all issues that people would vote wholeheartedly in favor of to 60-70%. But it's really difficult to try and put a voice to the unheard, to the invisible, to build infrastructure for people who don't exist yet, for people who aren't currently walking or cycling on the streets, but would if we built the appropriate infrastructure. So we have to thread that needle, and it's not easy, and I don't think anybody has the answer, but there are certainly things we can do, like scientific polls, like focus groups, like going out and engaging with people at these events, like Graffiti Day, like other open streets events, going to talk to people where they live, where they work, where they shop, where they are spending their time, and hopefully, presented with the evidence, then we can change the mindset of the elected officials and hopefully help them make decisions that are more reflective of the sentiment and the popular opinion within their neighborhood and their community.
I'm even surprised there's even an angry fringe which is resisting a good quality of life in the city. I think it probably comes from a misplaced set of what they think this whole movement stands for. Most places I hear coming back to the standard argument that this whole cycling movement is woke. And it's almost as though GDP is the primary thing and the car industry contributes to a lot. The way they come at it is, if you make the argument that it's not just about cycling, like you said, it is about get making the car less relevant of a choice in the city. Why should there even be an angry fringe which hates good livable place, right? It's just
Yeah.
that our positioning is possibly that when I talk about cycling, so I have been clocking a lot of people riding bicycles who have given up their cars on a tech platform and trying to show those numbers. And I've even heard senior government officials say, but that's not an aspirational goal for people. It's coming out of some preconceived notions that have been set in the people's minds over time, that this is the only way people move, and there's no distinction between the quality of life in a city and taking your car and heading out into the countryside. Have you seen that anywhere else, this kind of an attitudinal thing play out, and how do people
Yeah.
tackle these?
Yeah, I think sustainable mobility is one of those really difficult things to change because it is so personal and it's so emotional for people. They use it They use mobility every day. They have opinions which are informed or uninformed. If we were having this conversation about sustainable electricity, like the shift to wind or other forms of mobility, you wouldn't have nearly the same amount of passion or dissenting opinions to it. We'd just be making those changes because we know it's the right thing to do. But in this case, everybody uses transportation. They use their streets every day. Everybody's an expert on their own neighborhood, their own city, and they have a lot of biases and also inaccurate ideas about the way their transportation system currently functions and what we're arguing for as agents of change, because they see right now a one-sided transportation system that's all cars, and they think that we're trying to argue a like-for-like replacement, that we're going to come in and take everyone's car away and replace it with bicycles, as if that's the only black and white alternative. And of course, we're arguing for more gray area where there are subtleties. It's a multimodal system where every mode of transportation has its place, and they just can't fathom or imagine that kind of alternative. So I think in a lot of these instances, it's about addressing that very real fear, uncertainty, doubt about change, because it's a natural human instinct. But at the same time, understanding that you're never going to get 100% consensus. You don't need 100% consensus. You don't need to convince all of the naysayers and the doubters and the opponents. All you really need to do, again, is find a voice to that quiet majority, and then get it in front of the elected officials. Help them understand what you're arguing for. Help them understand that this is a popular movement, and one thing that they've done really well in the Netherlands here is forming coalitions, consensus that perhaps only represents 60 or 70% of the city, but is enough to start making change. And once you start implementing change, people see it, they experience it, they use it, and they argue for more change, instead of just standing around waiting for 90 or 100% consensus on idea, which you're never going to reach, and standing around arguing about drawings or renderings or hypothetical futures. We can start building this stuff, and it's one of the best ways to change hearts and minds is for people, as they say, seeing is ultimately believing.
Fair enough. I'll just get to the hardware piece a little bit now, because it's a critical portion of how we create these livable cities. Now, before we get into the I am not Amsterdam argument, it's also around the cycling culture in Amsterdam. The word culture is something we use quite liberally. Here, in most other countries, I would assume cycling has a cult status. It is usually a cyclist is associated with somebody who's on a recreational bike, riding around in lycra, and it's usually associated with sports, because the bikes are also sold just with a seat on them, right? It just carries your bum around. You don't have place to put things, right? You have been observing and have now been a user of the cycling culture in Amsterdam. What is this thing really? Is there a cycling culture? Is there such a thing as a culture? How did that grow, if it is there? And what is cycling to people living in the Netherlands?
Oh boy, yeah, it's another very complex situation, and I think you're absolutely right in insofar as elsewhere in the world, the moment you get on a bike, you become a cyclist, and it's not just while you're riding that bike. It is where in your day-to-day lives you're referred to as the cyclist, as if that mode of transportation suddenly defines you, and you don't use the bus or tram or train or car. You are the cyclist, because it's easy to other when a mode of transportation is so in the minority, it's so fringe, that we can identify cyclists as a subset of society, and group them in all together, and you're suddenly responsible for the behavior of all other cyclists, and so on and so forth. And yeah, you're right in saying that cyclists don't really exist in the Netherlands. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Den Haag, Utrecht, where I live in Delft, you're not a cyclist because 80 to 90% of the population uses a bike at least once a week. They're no longer an other. They are doctors, lawyers, mayors, city councillors, hairdressers, construction workers, teachers, and everybody in between. And it's important to get to that point, because then cycling just becomes like walking, like taking the bus, like any other mode of transportation. It's a tool that they use to get around their city. But it takes, decades to get to that point in terms of creating mass cycling in your city, making it the first choice for so many people. This culture of normalcy didn't rise up out of its own accord. It grew around the infrastructure that was built. And when you build bike lanes that work for 80-year-olds, they work for 8-year-olds, then suddenly cycling can flourish. Everybody does it. And then you start seeing, these mundane activities like carrying a plank of wood or a Christmas tree or sitting on the back seat of the bicycle. I mean, these are all things that Dutch people do without thinking, without that they're doing something strange. But then as an outsider, as a Canadian, I'm still in awe of the weird and wonderful things that Dutch people do on their bike. And of course, I'm still photographing it and sharing it on social media. But I think, it comes down to safety. As soon as you feel safe, as soon as you feel comfortable, as soon as you feel like the streets belong to you, then suddenly it's a cycling culture that is accessible to everybody. And the alternative, of course, being streets where only the fit, the brave, the young, the lifestyle cyclists who have chosen cycling as a political statement, as an identity, only those people are riding, and it's again easy to denigrate and other those people. So there's a huge gap between that reality and what cities are aspiring to, and it's infrastructure to help build that culture. And then, of course, there are other softer things that we can do to encourage that the culture to build around the infrastructure. It's not one or the other, but without building safe streets, cycling is still just going to be a subset of society and an easy kind of group to just dismiss as a bunch of woke hippies or whatever.
That reminds me, if somebody drives a car, they are not called a driver. It's just a thing you do, right?
Exactly.
If you're going on a bus, you're not called like a busser. You just go on a bus. But I don't know why just going on a cycle, you're called a cyclist. But the 80-year-old and an 80-year-old being safe on a city reminds me of Enrique Penalosa's 880 cities that he talked about. A city is not, if the city is not safe for an 8 or an 80-year-old, it's not a city worth living in. I still remember that quote. But that reminds me also that there was Felipe Ramirez here from his transport secretary in Bogota was here. And I asked him something about, because I was talking about the bus rapid transit system, I said, has any city solved the last mile issue in getting to the trains? Of course, the bus gets to places where you can just walk to it, but trains don't. And he said Amsterdam has gotten pretty close. That's the only city I can think of. Or he meant the Netherlands and most cities there. Uh, what role did infrastructure building play in the Netherlands? What do you think other cities can learn from this blueprint that they have built on the hardware side of things? We did talk about the software. What do you have to say to that?
I think this is a really interesting area, and one of the things that the Dutch do incredibly well. I mean, you see the tens of thousands of bike parking spaces at most of the train stations here, and it's easy to kind of be wowed by its beauty and its scale. But at the heart of it, it's a very intelligent approach that the planners and the engineers have made to not view cycling and public transportation as competitors, but actually see them as allies. And cycling is used as you've said, as a first mile, last mile connector which in combination with it's mostly the train network, which serves as almost a national metro system, because the Netherlands is quite small, but in its speed and its frequency, you can get to most cities in the Netherlands in about an hour. You cycle quite easily to the train station. You can often cycle directly into the bike parking that's below the train station, get a free, secure bike parking space in that facility, and then straight down to the platforms, tap your public transport card, hop on the train. I'd take it a couple times a week to our office in Utrecht. And then on the other side of the journey, it's tapping the very same card to borrow a bike. On the other end of the journey, OB Fiets. So you've got the cycling that bookends the train journey and provides the car-free alternative over distances of 100 or 200 kilometers if necessary. So the two modes really complement each other in that regard, because by enabling cycling to the railway station, we increase the catchment area. Suddenly it's, you can cycle about 4-5 times the distance that you would otherwise walk in the same time and energy output. So if you stretch that over a circle with a 4-5 kilometer radius, it's actually 25 or 30 times the passengers that can access the system. And then, we're inducing not just more public transport passengers, but more cyclists in the city, because a lot of people now are cycling to or from the train station. So the two kind of modes of transportation work in synergistically with one another, and it's a model that other cities around the world are looking to replicate. We go to American cities and European cities to talk about doing similar things in terms of feeding the cycling infrastructure networks into the public transportation system. It means they have to be designed in combination with each other, providing that secure bike parking at the stops and stations, the rental system at the other end of the journey. And that's really how we compete with the car over longer and longer distances. If it's seamless, if it's time competitive, if it's enjoyable, and it's certainly cost competitive insofar as, again, the inordinate price that we pay to drive and park our cars. The bike train alternative is so more attractive in a lot of ways if it's designed suitably. So this was a topic we spent a lot of time on when we were in India, because obviously cities across India are going gangbusters on their metro system. It's I think one of the reasons for hope, because the national government right now is really excited about building metros, but unfortunately they're not looking at how people actually access those metro systems on foot, on bike, on public transport. It's still seen as a single mode of transportation in isolation. One of the more shocking things that we experienced in Delhi was, getting off the metro system and suddenly being thrown into 8 lanes of motor traffic with no consideration for how people on foot or bike or any other mode of transport actually access the metro system. And of course, it's important to build these metro systems as quickly as possible, but they're never really going to attract the amount of ridership. They're never really going to fulfill their true potential until the authorities that are making the decisions, that are designing the metro systems, are thinking about their passengers and how they arrive and depart from those metro stations.
True. And the public transport is a big useful thing to have in India, but there is an overkill on the metro, though. Some of the cities that don't need it are having it. But nevertheless, getting to the metro and the suburban train systems and the bus systems is a useful thing to look at. So, what have been your experiences in India before we get to the other parts of the world? You have observed them, you have done workshops here with people. Um, Being in India, my personal observations on looking at livability is it is a hard nut to crack. You did talk about the backlash. There's also a lack of general knowledge on how to build. We do ask people build a cycle track. They come back and say, "Hey, I just did this thing, but it's not working." Right? I put a concrete thing and I put a paint over it, and it's just slippery. What am I supposed to do? I want to put a bicycle stand, but I don't know how to build that. There are people who are trying to get that experience. There is quite a bit of expertise in the general population, but there's also the planners and designers are not having the right adequate knowledge to be able to help them right on time. There are lots of pilots that have been tried recently, you know, promoted by the central government, and there have been lots of bicycle separators. Some did not work, so there is an experimentation going on. But India is placed in this position that it's an aspirational growing economy. We are now at around 4 trillion. We want to get to 10 trillion very quickly, and everything is focused on getting there because that gives us the power and the cloud. Everything else, all the livability can wait kind of a scenario. But there is also an increasing need from the authorities to solve the problems that it is creating. So they are continuing to create problems at a fast pace, but are unable to move fast enough to solve them by curbing the car. Again, we go back to that, right? What do you think is the learning? If you talk about Amsterdam, they say we are not Amsterdam. We have to show that picture you put up of Amsterdam in the 1970s. They don't see that. They only see it now and say, oh, we are not them. They are too small. There are too little people. What are all the arguments you've heard, and what do you think is a roadmap for India?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head in your question, and this was something we heard constantly when we were in Delhi a few weeks ago. Was the Western world is in the luxurious position of being in optimization mode. They're focused on tweaking their cities to make them more livable, more sustainable, more accessible, and that India is still in the hypergrowth stage. They're still in the build phase, and we'll get stuff on the ground as quickly as possible. We don't have time to worry about the details. We don't have time to get it perfect the first time around. And, every time I heard that, I would push back a little bit and say, well, why is it either or? Why can't we get it right the first time in this hypergrowth stage? Why do we have to get it, come back and fix it later? Why can't we, if we just pause and take a breath and go about this a bit more intelligently, a bit more with a bit more vision and aspiration, then surely we can save everyone a lot of time and money in terms of retrofitting our cities to hopefully get it right and apply some of the learnings of other places. So, I mean, we saw this, and part of the work we're doing right now with the Dutch Cycling Embassy is capacity building, is teaching engineers, planners at the municipal level, at the state level, basic skills. And these are not skills that they are taught, unfortunately, in planning school or engineering school. How to design a cycling network, how to design a cycle path, how to design a cycle-friendly intersection, how to combine cycling with public transportation. These are not considerations that are currently being made by a lot of Indian cities. But if they do want to address things like the road safety situation, which is something like 18% of the world's road fatalities are in India, we can't be thinking of this as an afterthought, as something we'll deal with later. We have to be building it into our systems, into the standards, into our manuals, into our trainings, to hopefully, make it, get it right the first time instead of coming back and fixing it later. So the work we will continue to do, hopefully, is to scale up those trainings, to teach more cities, more states, give those people on the ground that are designing these facilities the skills, the tools, the best practices that they need to translate them onto Indian streets. And when you refer to the Netherlands, of course, we hear, well, the Netherlands is very different. It's flat, it's cooler temperatures, it's very different context. And of course, we're not denying that fact, but it doesn't mean we should dismiss the Netherlands outright as irrelevant because, as I said, through 50 years of trial, error, experimentation, innovation, they now have a pretty solid book of best practices in all of these areas of design and engineering and planning and policymaking that are just waiting for other cities to translate, to adapt, to make use of. And that's the raison d'etre, the reason the Dutch Cycling Embassy exists is not to make money or to colonize the world and make it quote unquote Dutch, but to hopefully provide them teachings, learnings, and ideas, inspiration, and information. The Netherlands did this. They went down the car-dominated path for decades after the war. They reversed that vicious circle of car dependency, the Dutch did it. It means you can do it virtually anywhere, but it's not again a matter of copying and pasting. It's being inspired, informed, and coming up with a solution that works in India, that's implemented by Indian people. But we can hopefully offer some teachings as to how you might go about that, and get it right the first time in the next several decades instead of coming back and fixing it in the next several hundred years.
Yeah, coming back and fixing it is not an option now anymore. The global climate change upon us, and we have to build this into the system, like you said, is build clean and build better. And you don't have to destroy things and then come back and try to revive them. It might just be too late sometimes. Uh, but what do you finally? I just want you to go around and compare how other cities across the world that you know of are dealing with this, not just from a climate standpoint, but from a livability standpoint as well for their own cities. Which ones are trying to curb the car and move towards a more livable city? What examples stand out to you, and how are they dealing with the backlash?
It's very inconsistent, and I think I'll be the first to admit the progress has been quite slow.
Mm-hmm.
Even in so-called front runners like Barcelona, like Paris, like Bogota, the car is still king in a lot of those places, and there's still so much work to do in insofar as achieving the same levels of livability as Dutch people enjoy every day. But I mean, those are three, I think, pretty incredible examples. Lesser known examples like Brussels, where they're implementing a traffic circulation plan, a traffic calming plan, a 30-kilometer-an-hour speed limit, a lot of new cycling infrastructure. In the face of vehement opposition, the mobility minister in charge there is under security detail because of the backlash that has existed. There are less likely candidates in Kampala, Uganda, where they are creating a non-motorized traffic plan. There are, again, another emerging economy where only a small percentage of the population has access to cars, but they're still building themselves around the car. I think there's a recognition there of this invisible cyclist or invisible pedestrian that makes up a significant portion of people in their cities, that they should be catered to. They deserve the dignity of safe streets. They deserve safe infrastructure. They deserve, we should be measuring, planning, designing for those people too, and not just this aspirational middle class that governments so often focus onto. Manila is another interesting example, and it's a city we worked with at the Dutch Cycling Embassy during the pandemic. They built 500 kilometers of new cycling infrastructure during the pandemic when they had to shut down their public transportation system entirely due to lockdown. And so to provide a safe means of transport to their essential workers for those essential trips, they built a lot of cycling infrastructure really fast in a 9-month period. And we were lucky enough, we were brought in by the World Bank and members of our network to provide a training program for the engineers there in terms of all of the elements of the cycle-friendly city, teaching them the skills that they need, which again they did not learn in school, to introduce the ideas. So they got it right the first time instead of coming back and refining it, tweaking it, which is always an option, but you want to put the best possible product down on the ground the first time, so that you provide people with a safe and comfortable piece of infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, we're doing a lot of work in Southeast Asia right now.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't resulted in yet in physical changes, but we're doing capacity buildings, trainings, workshops in cities in Vietnam and Thailand and Singapore, and very excited to see what comes out of those in the years ahead. So, and of course, India, and through our partnership with GIZ, the German Development Bank, we will continue to do these trainings across India and hopefully scale up our efforts. And yeah, there's at some point there has to be a tipping point, and not to end on a sour note, but of course we all know the pollution situation in Delhi in particular. You know, it was tangible in the air when we were there. You could not breathe, and schools were canceled because of the air pollution situation. People were obviously avoiding going outside and exercising, and if you have a chronic lung condition, you know, it's an unlivable environment. And of course, it's not just the car traffic; it's other elements as well. But we've got to be reaching a tipping point, a recognition that cars are a solution; they're not the solution, and we need to recognize all the negative externalities that come with them, and make sure that they are well designed for, but not solely designed for. That we can approach our budgeting, our planning, our policymaking in a much more balanced way. But it does take a recognition at all levels of government, and we're unfortunately not yet seeing that.
Are you getting your Christmas tree on your cargo bike, or do you already did?
We did this past weekend, yeah. And if you go to our social media feeds, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., there's some nice photos of Melissa carrying a 2-meter tall Christmas tree on a shared cargo bike. Car-Guru is the local service here, so it's an annual tradition. This was our 10th year in a row. It's quite special, and if you follow the hashtag Tree by Bike, you'll see images of people all around the world doing the same.
Should take a look at that. I found it really hard to find a picture of you carrying a tree by bike, and I think I found one. I have put it on the intro thumbnail for this YouTube podcast. Thank you very much, Chris, for your time talking to us and explaining these things. It's really useful. It was a learning experience for me. I hope the listeners find it useful as well. So do like, subscribe, share, and watch this podcast for more. Thanks once again, Chris, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.